So please may I welcome you back then to the last session of today's webinar, which is going to have two conversations in it. The first one will be Kat Rossi with Stephen Burks, and the second one, Jana, will be speaking with Liam Young. So let me just introduce very quickly Stephen to you, and then I'll pass straight over to Kat, who will start the conversation. So Stephen is probably one of the most recognized American industrial designers of his generation, and his New York-based studio, Stephen Burks Man-Made, focuses on craft techniques that challenge the limits of new technologies within industrial production. He studied architecture at Columbia Graduate School, architecture planning, preservation, and product design at Illinois Institute of Technology's Institute of Design. So let me pass over to Kat, who will now start the conversation.
Thank you, Penny. And thank you, Stephen. Really, it's really fantastic to have you here with us. And I know it's quite early in the morning and where you are. We've been
not so bad.
Extra thanks. And in fact, today, one of the joys, in a sense, of doing this online is that we've got people from all over the world joining us at different times. So we appreciate that very much. And I've long been an admirer of your work, so I was really pleased that we were able to include your roping stool in the at-home exhibition, which we see on this image here, which is a shot of one of the identities section of the show that we see with some other pieces that talk about identities in different ways. And this section really thinks about how we construct our identities through design objects and how those objects in turn construct our identities. So in terms of a kind of an easy kickoff question, I guess, would be if you could just talk us through this object that we see on the left here, through your roping stool.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you, Catherine, for having me here. It's an honor to be in such great company. I mean, this image is incredible. To see my roping stool approximate with a Torre Satsas is quite an honor. The roping stool was a project that was developed with Dedar Milano some years ago through casual conversation with two people that became my friends over time, Raffaele Fabrizio and Caterina Fabrizio. So we were both interested in each other as, I guess, creatives, and I was fascinated by what they do as a textile company. Textiles have always been very interesting to me in the way that they can kind of quickly embody a sensibility, or how can I say, translate various sensibilities in terms of global influence through fabric and color and pattern, etc. And so when perusing their collection and visiting the factory, I was really struck by the trimmings, the idea that these small decorative elements added to what may typically be a very plain textile can give a dramatic effect. And you know, it's interesting that this is framed through the perspective of identity, because looking at the box of trimmings, I immediately thought to myself, well, you know, I see these not as individual objects, but as a kind of collective. And as a collective, they had a vocabulary for me that I felt was quite unique. So rather than choose a particular textile, which was already, I felt, coded with so much meaning through Dedar, based on the fact that it was part of a larger collection, the fact that it arrives temporally between, you know, after the last collection, before the next, et cetera, and in terms of the lineage of ideas that they were building upon, I really wanted to draw from something that felt somehow separate and somehow more open-ended. So we didn't know what we were going to make together, and it began with some experiments in combining the trimmings together. So what I found was in working with a seamstress that I've collaborated with over the years, and combining the trimmings together, we were able to make a kind of larger, almost linear patchwork, which began to speak to, you know, the individual pattern languages that I could see, but also the collective, right? What were they becoming as a whole? What were they becoming if we switched one with the other? What were they becoming if we changed the color of one with another? And so these belts were produced, I guess you could call them, these wraps, these I don't know, almost like a bit of a fashion accessory, one could say, right? But we needed a body. And so the body, the body came through, thinking about the idea, I guess, the function of what the piece would be, even though the piece really has more of a visual function than a physical function. Thinking about the dimensions of the body, thinking about, I guess, the activity. My work has always been more interested in the scale of the hand, the body, and the interior than a kind of architectural space, and the role that objects play in transforming the interior and transforming how we feel. So the texture was something that I was looking for. There's a kind of refinement in the data art textiles that I wanted to contrast and complement. And the manila rope was, I guess, a readily accessible and economical way to do that. So we took the manila rope and I thought about it almost in a kind of cellular way, right? So we wanted to combine it with itself to build up a surface, to look at the kind of fibrous ends of it rather than the twisted surface. And so cutting across the grain of the rope was really important. And this is quite a handmade piece. I'm not typically making everything myself. But as the studio is called Stephen Burke's Man-Made, people believe that, I'm actively engaged in in making everything myself. In this situation, however, I did take on the role of the craftsman directly. And so handling, manipulating the rope from a large spool that we purchased and throwing it across the table saw, I cut every single one of these pieces myself by hand. And then I guess the next step was to think about how the surface, this kind of raw fibrous surface that we now revealed as a cross section, would meet the ground. And that's when it occurred to me to try to bring another material into it. And I remember Raffaele's reaction when I showed him the kind of first link of the roping stool, the first, let's say, larger strand that had been dipped in the black rubber. And he felt it had a very powerful sort of physical appeal, let's say, and referenced other ways of using the rope, et cetera, in relation to the body, which was really funny at the time. And so bringing it all together, right? I should say that each strand is hand dipped individually. Then the fibers are brought together to assemble a collection of stools, which in the end were various sizes. I think this is the medium size, in fact.
It's I'd read about the object, so I thought I knew it to a degree, but actually to hear you talk it through in such detail is really fantastic. And I think that and I hadn't really clocked that proximity with Sotsas's with the Carlton, that combination of the kind of fragmentation of visual language, but also the unity through those kind of through those differences coming together and the kind of banding of that. So that's really interesting. I'll take off this slide now because we're going to talk about some of your other works and just have a sort of general conversation. And actually, we explored using a number of your other works in the exhibition, such as the man-made Toronto series of lamps and other pieces that were from 2011, I think, made with Senegalese basket weavers, and also I think in particular the others lanterns for Dead On that I think is that bamboo piece, like kind of wrapped bamboo with or seam bent bamboo with these options of additional eyes that you can have attached to them. Rather nice feature. And the kind of reasons why we were particularly interested in all of these works is that they all speak to ideas of identity or more specifically identities in your work. And I wondered if you could just talk us through that in a bit of detail.
Of course. I mean, to be honest, having begun working internationally at the turn of the millennium, I was one of very few designers working abroad from America. I think I was the third designer, American designer ever work with Capellini, for example. I didn't really begin to think about the ways in which I was different from my American buddies that were coming over. It didn't really occur to me that my identity was playing a role in how people saw me in Milan. It really wasn't until, I don't know, around 2004, when there was a kind of pivotal New York Times article, and which happened to coincide with my work with Missoni, just kicking off as a consultant, and then which also happened to coincide with the first handmade object that we'd made, which were the Missoni patchwork vases, which then led to me being invited to work as a product development consultant in South Africa. So the role of identity in my work began 5 years into my work, when I began to see my identity reflected back at me. And you know, quite honestly, I looked around and noticed the lack of diversity amongst my peers, let's say. I mean, everyone was Eurocentric, where, you know, I wasn't. And so having the opportunity to go to work in South Africa really, I guess, placed it all in context to me and helped me sort of concretize my thoughts around the idea of everyone being capable of design. And, you know, I've always seen design as cultural production, not unlike fashion, not unlike art, not unlike architecture. It needs to kind of speak of our time and of ourselves. If it doesn't, it feels a bit empty to me. So there is something about the idea that I believe that design is capable of dealing with, or at least speaking to, the larger issues of our time, and trying to kind of answer these questions. If not answer them, at least bring them up, right? So it's not that a lamp can change how we see the world, but maybe a lamp can force us to question how we see ourselves and how we see each other. When we think about how much time we spend with the things around us, the things that we choose really embody who we are. And so as a designer, I've tried to, I suppose, challenge myself in the objects that I'm making to reflect a bit more of what's important to me and what I think is important for design to be speaking to, as we all kind of search for meaning, right, these days.
Yeah, and through acts of consumption, in many ways, rightly or wrongly, in some ways. So it's interesting that your the kind of the presence of identity in your work comes from your personal experience, but then it sounds like you also see design objects as having this potential to allow us to ask questions, to kind of interrupt maybe our conventional ideas about identity and how they.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, as a historian looking back over the history of design, right? I mean, taking that Satsas shelf as an example, you know, Memphis was not just a decorative movement, not just about form and color. It was about the ideas of the time. And so we may not see that today, but many of us may not see that today, but those of us that are students of design and students of history recognize those important markers, I guess, right? And so if we think about the others, for example, the eyes and the title and the idea of a lantern being a kind of companion was really important to me. So to bring forward that consciousness, let's say. And it's a very simple notion that, you know, this expanded aluminum structure woven through with extruded polyethylene, not bamboo. It's actually Dayton fiber, they call it, but extruded polyethylene. And then to give it character, right? To give it a sense of personality, to in some way allow it to reflect our personality, right? Our humanity. And so you imagine someone alone in the garden with their lantern, but their lantern has eyes. and their lantern is called the others. And so the idea that we were all the other once is really what that was about. To remind people that the people next door that may not look like them can also be their companion.
It's interesting, you're kind of manifesting, your work is manifesting and exploring a lot of ideas that have been coming up today, particularly in terms of our relationship with neighbours, near and far, and how COVID in particular has kind of changed that. Yeah. And your designs, if I've understood correctly, are focused primarily on the domestic sphere. And is there do you think that the home as a space and objects for the home have a particular kind of power in that sense, or is there a particular concept of the domestic that comes into your design?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I'm sure we'll probably talk about this later, but we're working on an exhibition with the High Museum now called Shelter in Place, which grew out of, all of us being in lockdown and having, the pandemic isn't over, but we've just gone through, a life event. Many of us lost loved ones, et cetera. Many of us were forced to confront our domestic space for the first time in years, right? Those of us that traveled quite frequently, or coming to terms with who we are as family members, who we are as partners, et cetera. Very important, I think, when we think about, what you encounter when you go home. What are you living with? What are the choices that you made? How do these objects inspire you or keep you going through difficult times? Or how do they support you? How do they give you privacy, a sense of privacy? How do they engage your imagination? All of these are ideas that the work in the exhibition will explore, the speculative project around Shelter in Place. But the home, for me, having studied architecture, life begins in the interior. The building and the landscape is a further expression of the interior, in a sense. And unfortunately, many architects ignore the interior experience. So it took studying architecture for me to arrive at the importance of the interior in terms of the influence on humanity. It's where we come together. It's where we express our most intimate thoughts to one another. It's where we really come to terms with our bodies. And so, of course, it's very natural for me to want to have that type of influence.
Absolutely. It's really fascinating to hear that relationship between design and architecture kind of really interplaying and obviously informing your work. And your work seems to in general kind of always be crossing over these different spheres, different boundaries. So from the scale of design to that of architecture, from working with small scale artisans to large companies, but also to injecting or marrying this kind of identity politics really at heart with kind of more commercial brands or kind of commercial ends. And I wonder how you find that other kind of hybridity in your work.
Yeah, hybridity is a good word. In 2011, when you mentioned the show in Toronto, that was actually the second venue for my first solo show, Stephen Burke's Man-Made. It began at the Studio Museum in Heirloom, and that's relevant because it was the first time that the Studio Museum had ever shown design since it was founded in 1968. Thelma Golden, the director there, is such an important figure for those of us in the African diasporic community working in art and in cultural production, in the ways that she's helped so many people find their voice, I guess, in a sense, through these exhibitions at the Studio Museum. And so it for us, for my studio, it was the moment that I fully understood what we were, in a sense, capable of. There was this kind of culmination of, the title of the show, Stephen Burke's Man-Made, really contextualized all of the ideas that we were trying to do. And then at the same time, the project was very specific to look at Senegalese coil basket weaving as a starting point for the reinvention of objects in the domestic space. And so if we take a step back from that, that becomes just one example of the ways in which I've tried to work around the world. and how important it is for us to work at creating more space in contemporary design for other voices, voices outside of, let's say, the minority world of contemporary design, a very exclusive space that is mostly a Western project, right? And so if we look outside to the other, what's been described as the other 90%, but what is rightly described as the majority world, right? There is another way of working, which is coming from their own society and their own traditional means, indigenous knowledge, et cetera, that's been passed down for generations, that is very much a hand-related project that we haven't considered design, but that I considered design. And so our work is, from the Studio Museum forward, is a hybridity project, because I just think that life should be design should be. There's just so many other things that design can embody, and I think it's inherently hybrid, at least from our perspective.
Well, I have to confess, I took the word hybrid from you. So it was reading your word.
Well, it's funny. I took a long way to say that. At the same time, I had an exhibition at the MAD, the Museum of Art and Design, called Stephen Burke's "Are You a Hybrid?" And so that was really questioning, looking at a number of objects, from Satsas to Martin van Severen, even, to say that this idea of hybridity has existed throughout for quite a long time in art and design and architecture.
But I think that in particular, what we've called, now kind of the post-colonial perspective on that is something actually that obviously they weren't exploring, but you're definitely bringing to the table.
Right.
I wanted to push a bit more. You used the word reinvention that I thought was really interesting, and in particular the framing of the at-home exhibition and the theme of the broader design biennial is bifurcations. So this, this idea of kind of taking a different path or pushing from the mainstream. And we've talked a bit about how in your aesthetics, you can see that in terms of the different visual language. But just as you were talking then about, the kind of dominance of, say, kind of Western authorship and Western, design language, I wonder, is there something also about the typologies in terms of product and furniture that you're interested in kind of renegotiating or reconceiving in some way?
I mean, I am drawn to objects that offer different ways of using them, right? Different, more, I guess if you look at Dala, for example, it is a kind of improvised seating concept. It's intentionally circular to kind of break away from traditional planning norms. And so, I think that there's a certain freedom that can be explored in the forms that we give design that have to do with, where, let's say, a shelving unit should stand. I mean, does it have to stand against the wall? Could it also be freestanding? Does a lounge chair have to sit in the corner, or could it be that it sits in the center of the room? I mean, these ideas, I think, are part of, bigger notions that we're trying to explore. It's true. It's very difficult, though, to invent a typology or to introduce completely new typologies to design. We often are given briefs and we're often asked to design specific things, but we push and pull where we can. In terms of identity, looking at our most recent work during lockdown, we developed the Salvatore mirror collection, Friends and Neighbors. And that's really the first product that I've ever designed without ever having met the client. So it's really interesting, that moment of being separated from everyone. And that to me was really about, okay, how do we first of all take these little pieces of marble, these little scraps of marble, and give them new life? But then how do we also secondarily take the typology of a mirror and reverse it, in a sense, and make it about someone that you're not seeing as opposed to someone that you're seeing, right? So that the reflection of yourself in the mirror as a reminder that, you know, you have friends, that you have neighbors, and maybe you want to check in with them as much as you're checking in with yourself, right? So it's a funny object, but thinking about the reinvention of typologies there, it's maybe more marble than mirror. And so
Yeah,
it's a little bit challenging in that regard, right?
it's an interesting collection that you've got these kind of, they're like mirrors with these stone kind of segments, and then these the kind of mirror itself partially concealed by it. And as you say, that was born during COVID, and from what I understand, a project, as you say, that talks about the kind of the self, but also community, which links again to our exhibition in terms of, we talk about the idea of a kind of re-engagement with community, particularly through the kind of COVID experience. So and there's an interesting kind of change of scale there, in a sense, or a kind of relationship that you go from the, not just the individual and the self in their kind of atomized home, but understanding that the self and the home exist in this broader kind of nexus. And I wonder if that, if that kind of comes into your work in any way.
Well, I mean, during lockdown here in New York, that summer was hugely volatile. I mean, with the death of George Floyd, we found ourselves marching in the streets and calling for once again calling for racial equity in this country, and it's so hard to describe the feeling of not being heard, of not being understood, or in many ways not being recognized for one's humanity. So that marching in the street, and that acknowledgement that it's not just us, right? It's not just African American history is American history. And American history is fraught with so much violence and so much anger and pain against so many people, for reasons that one can't explain. But thinking about the fact that we live in society with one another, but we often don't acknowledge that society in America. We often don't acknowledge our reliance on each other, right, as human beings. There's the capitalist project is so heavy, right, that it sort of wipes out all of the need for a socialist project. And so how do you, from design's perspective, of course, you're living at home as an individual, but your home is connected to someone else's home. Your yard is connected to someone else's yard, right? Your door faces someone else's door. We can only build fences so high. We can only build walls so high, and that search for the individual has really cut us off from one another. So those are really big ideas. Not to say that all of that is channeled into a mirror, but I don't know. I try to allow my work to speak, if I can, of these layers of humanity, right? Because design is for people.
Yeah, and it sounds like you can't not let that kind of that intention come into your work. I guess we've got 2 minutes for a last question, which might be too big a question, really.
No, please.
I'm interested in building on what you were just talking about, whether the design object is where you think you're going to continue to focus those kind of questions and focus as a place of questioning, or whether there are other places or other media that you might want to work with. And then I saw that you set up this space, Contemporaries, for example, in New York last year, was it, or 2020? And so I wondered if you could just kind of reflect on where your practice maybe is going as a result, perhaps, of COVID and George Floyd and his other experiences.
Yeah, thank you for that. Design is accessible to me. And so at the moment, and it's taken quite a long time for design to become accessible to me, and the work that I'm trying to do in design in terms of, being present, being who I am, opening those doors for future generations of people of African descent or people of color to feel welcome in contemporary design. All of those things are, we've only just begun. So there's a lot more work for me to do in design. Although sometimes I wonder if the perception of design isn't too narrow for the larger narrative, right? And so I'm writing more. I'm looking for other outlets to express those bigger ideas, and I'm constantly here and present in design in order to continue to express those big ideas. Yeah. So.
Thank you, Stephen. I have more I want to ask, but I see
that
our time is up. But we do have time after the conversation with Liam for some questions after that. So please stay on the line, as it were. And
thank you.
I'll hand over to Penny. Thank you.
Thank you for absolutely fascinating conversation. I thought we could go on for a lot longer, but we will pick things up in the conversation after Liam's conversation. Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. Okay, so we're going to move now to Jana, who's going to come on screen, who's going to be talking with Liam Young. Let me just give a very brief introduction to Liam. He's an architect, director, and BAFTA-nominated producer who operates, most importantly, in the spaces between design, fiction, and futures. And his visionary films really act as urgent examinations of the environmental questions that face us today. So I'm going to leave it at that and let Jana start the conversation.
Thank you so much, Penny. And welcome, Liam. Thank you so much for joining us at this very terribly early hour for you. And I would like to kind of start with congratulations to your solo show, which has just opened in Madrid, I believe.
Yeah, thanks.
We would like to talk about your film, Planet City, which is not only the most contemporary object, I believe, in the exhibition, because it launched in December 2020, I believe. It is also the last object in the exhibition, a film that we see as kind of summarizing in many ways the topics of the exhibition that we address, speaking about shelter, questioning identity, well-being, and connectedness. And I would like to kind of start in asking Liam, can you introduce? Unfortunately, we can't show the film to our participants. So could you introduce the film briefly?
Sure. I mean, Planet City is a film set in an imaginary city for 10 billion people, the projected population of the world in 2050. And it's a provocation, a thought experiment around what could happen if we radically reversed the planetary sprawl, the planetary scaled city we currently all occupy. In many ways, each one of us are already living in a kind of planet city. That is a city the scale of the entirety of the earth that has been stitched together through the processes of colonialism and late capital. We have remade the earth from the scale of the cell to the tectonic plate, and Planet City is a project that imagines what would happen if we came to the design of cities with a very radically different idea about density. So it began with the idea of Edward O. Wilson's Half-Earth, a seminal biologist who imagined that we could stave off mass extinction if we restricted human development to 50% of the planet, thereby returning the other 50% to a process of rewilding. And that's, a lot of biologists and environmentalists kind of look at how we might scaffold the recovery of the 50% of the earth that we leave behind. But of course, the architect in me wanted to know what would happen to the 50% of the earth that we would actually have to live in, because that would represent like a substantial and an extraordinary scaling back of our current development. And that's really where the Planet City began. But as we started to work, we realized that at the scale of the densest cities that currently exist, like Manila, for instance, this 10 billion city could actually exist at a scale similar to a single state of US, not 50% Earth, but rather 0.02% Earth, thereby kind of returning the rest of the planet to a sort of globally scaled wilderness. And that's the project, really, is to look at what that city could be. How would it work? How could it run on renewable energy systems? What would life be like there? What would the festivals and carnivals and cultural life of the city look like if we are all kind of compressed together into one place?
I would like to come to the city in a minute, but before we come, I would just draw our attention for a minute to the idea of nature rewilding, because the question I have is, what does it mean to this relationship between humans and non-humans? Because I assume that most non-humans organisms would prefer to live in nature, and so live not necessarily in the kind of densely populated area. Is this a necessity, a cautionary tale, or is this intention between, or a division between human and non-human intended at all?
Yeah, I mean, like there isn't any kind of walls around Planet City, as you might imagine in some sort of dystopian sci-fi, and people get shot if they transgress and wander off into the landscape beyond. It's much more akin to a national park boundary. You know, you can wander through it and visit. You can't chop down a tree. You can't like go hunting, but you can occupy it. I mean, similarly, Planet City, the urban landscapes itself is, you know, run through with canyons and vertical orchards, stacked farms and wildlife corridors. So there isn't a separation within the city itself either. But the city itself is an attempt to leave. It's about leaving space for other species. Normally, at the moment, we designate a part of the planet. We draw a line around it as a means to extract from it. Either that's financial or physical resource. Here in Planet City, we draw a line around the majority of the Earth as a means to leave it empty. So it represents a radical shift in what we might think of as human-centered design. In many ways, Planet City is the end of human-centered design. That phrase is normally used as an alibi to kind of, you know, talk about tree-lined streets and cafes spilling out onto sidewalks. But at the same time, human-centered design, as in design based around us as a species, is the reason we're in the hole we've created for ourselves. You know, because we have sort of privileged ourselves above everything else. Planet City is much more interested in kind of carbon-centered design, or sort of atmospheric-centered design, wetland-centered design, whipping crane-centered design as its primary driver. So it's trying to imagine what it might mean to responsibly share our planet. And maybe that means that the luxury of owning a single family home with a bit of front yard, a bit of backyard, 2 bits down the side where you keep the bins in a 3-car garage is no longer something that is possible. In a way, it never was possible. We just lived in a kind of delusion that suggested that it could have been. And Planet City suggests that that time is over.
That, yeah, the film makes this really nice, this point, which of course for some people really feels dystopian, that the human, because it takes the kind of security away, that we are in the center. And I would like to kind of frame a next question more to kind of then ask what happens then to us human being. And you kind of touched upon it already a little bit. And we would in the exhibition probably argue we need to redefine identity for us human beings in such a city. But the film makes a really nice kind of, and in many ways surprising move, because it presents a carnival. Could you speak a little bit about this? Why is the carnival of new culture celebrating, as you say, new myths of care, belonging and recreation?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of visions of the future imagine, like utopian visions at least, imagine that things like mythology and folklore and religion at some point evolved away from, right? They're seen as being, in quotes, primitive. And any kind of enlightened society doesn't trouble itself with such follies. Whereas there is no evidence for that in any way. Like this kind of cultural relationship to the world and the objects around us always continues, and more so than that, it's actually how we begin to enculturate the unfamiliar. You know, emerging technologies and things that are somehow scary or fearful become wrapped up in story as a means for us to start to understand them and relate to them in new ways. So this kind of extraordinary disjunction from the world that we know into something like Planet City, it is imagined comes along with a whole new raft of kind of stories that we start to tell each other. Stories about the land we left behind, stories about the new city that we've made and the new technologies and the new relationships that it sets in motion. So we wanted to capture this cultural life, this very rich and active cultural life of the city. And part of that, you know, one of the first things we did was, if you put all of the citizens of the world in one place, we mapped onto a calendar every sort of festival, cultural happening, carnival, religious holiday and we realized that any single day there's like 20 things going on. So Planet City is this perpetual party. So we imagine there's this sort of continual carnival that snakes through the city on a 365-day loop. Sort of each day it intersects with a different culture, a different neighborhood, changing its form, endlessly kind of cycling through new colors and costume. And we wanted to capture that, to say that this city is sort of equal parts dystopia and utopia, but we still dance, we still love, we still play, we still dress up, we still scream and hate, and we're still different. We're not all the same in this single city, but perhaps the compression into this one place means that those differences get amplified and exaggerated. You know, we thought it was an important way to visualize the city, very different to, you know, the sort of single white male overthrowing the corporate cyberpunk dystopia that we commonly see in science fiction. Let's visualize a celebration.
That is really beautiful, and it connects nicely to earlier discussions that we had, which unfortunately you couldn't take part because they were in the middle of the night in Los Angeles, but where Anna and Rian Mucking argued for a kind of also expansion on the one side, expansion of the idea of home and what home could be in this, where on the one side we spoke about how we need a new vocabulary to kind of talk about how home, what home might feel like. And on the other side, this expansion into public space, and that public space becomes part of our understanding of home. With your film, we are able in the exhibition to talk about the planet as our home. How in Planet City, what does the public space mean? Or is there something like public space?
Yeah, I mean, Planet City works through the radical sharing of resources. Like Planet City isn't just the city footprint, just a residential accommodation for 10 billion, but rather all of the energy landscapes, the productive landscapes, the food resources required to support such a city also are contained within its footprint. So the sorts of things that normally exist out on the periphery of our cities and on the edges of our own consciousness about who we are and what a city is get wrapped and entwined in the very city itself. So the idea of productive landscapes become new forms of public space as well. We imagine narratives of people wandering through the stacks of vertical farms, occupying them, inhabiting them like you would a public park. floating along the hydroelectric dam canals, drifting across the algae farms, looking at the blooms before harvest, that this kind of mythical outside where we dump all our waste or we produce all our energy becomes new public space and new public infrastructure that's wrapped through the city. At the same time, as I mentioned, like the singular dwelling, this idea that wealth becomes a representation of how many things we can accumulate that we then stuff into our homes, gets reimagined, and new forms of belonging start to take shape, not through physical objects, but through shared cultural practices. And neighborhoods become about the urban constructs that shape identity, as opposed to the glorification of this single family home. And you start to get really interesting moments where you start to imagine that the redundancy of our current world, our current cities, the idea that I'm here in an apartment building in Los Angeles, there's probably 200 apartments here, each apartment has its own kitchen. On the other side of the wall to my kitchen is probably another kitchen. We start to imagine shared neighborhood kitchens as a kind of resource. We start to imagine, like the redundancy of me owning a hammer and then my neighbor owning a hammer, and then that neighbor owning a hammer. Like there might just be one hammer that we collectively share on a timetable, and things like machine learning can facilitate the kind of sharing and intense timetabling that might have to happen in order to manage those resources. So neither is it a project that runs away from technology, but it imagines that technology can actually facilitate new forms of belonging and being.
Also very much technology in the service of the human being, not, as we have noticed during COVID, especially, how many times we realize that actually the technology is quite questionable in its support of us rather than something else, whether this is commerce or security or etc. This brings me to a point that how do you envisage then the well-being aspect in this city? You spoke about that we would probably flock to these farms that are not necessarily the safest for us or to see, but also this extreme density. Some people would argue that probably density brings always this question of that wouldn't be then how much space do you need? I mean, a long historic discussion that we had with minimum dwellings, et cetera. How much do we need as an individual to kind of feel comfortable, to feel safe, especially in we had just earlier discussed this question of illness, sickness, that probably might need also separations.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly don't need the space we have now. Let's say that. A lot of times, and part of the impetus for the project is that density in science fiction is always seen as being dirty and disgusting. Every dystopian city is somehow a denser city than what we currently all occupy. That's not necessarily true. Like some of the most vibrant and extraordinary urban moments occur in dense cities. Some of the most attractive environments that we've created for ourselves are environments of density. Density brings together unlike things in really confounding and extraordinary and exciting ways. Density creates a sort of critical mass of functions and activities and services. So it's certainly a call to arms, a rally cry to say that we don't need to live with the means that we currently do, that we can actually shrink back our resources and be much more efficient, and both in terms of our lifestyle, but also the resources become so much more, are used so much more efficiently when we start to exist together in more dense scenarios. So it's certainly a claim for that. But it's at the same time, it's a multi-generational project. You know, Planet City imagines the evolution of such a project occurring through a kind of global consensus, as opposed to, you know, some kind of United Nations necessary, some sort of United Nations entity declaring itself, forcing everyone at gunpoint to move to the city tomorrow. It happens across multiple generations, and across that time, we, you know, the sort of luxuries that we become enculturated today, in many ways, begin to be forgotten. And we start to become more accustomed and acclimatized to living within our means. And soon the idea that we used to live on acreages for ourselves, that sort of opulence is going to be seen as being violent almost, and scandalous, you know. And Planet City is trying to prototype and visualize what the necessary lifestyle changes that we might have to go through will look like in order to sustain 10 billion people on this earth. And at the same time, you know, if we don't like what we see, then maybe that means that, you know, what we need to be doing is somehow limiting growth and shrinking. And maybe 10 billion people doesn't work at all, because we don't want to live in Planet City. If we do want to, like, you know, have our country homes and our 3-car garages, then somehow we need to figure out a way to end up at 5 billion people or 4 billion people. Is that a more reasonable sacrifice that we want to make, as opposed to living in a kind of an arrangement like Planet City? That's really the question that we hope is set in motion through the project. Planet City is not a proposal, you know, not like, it's over there, pack your bags, I'll see you on Tuesday, Jana. That's not the project. The project is really to get us to ask questions about what we deem as being critical to who we are, and then being extremely pragmatic about what it means to maintain and continue that lifestyle, because something has to change, either a radical densification of how we live, or a radical degrowth of the lives we currently lead.
I think this is an important point, and I'm grateful that you made this jump from kind of, this is not a suggestion. However, at the same time, it includes all these extremely radical ideas that are, however, and that is the important point, really connected to the conditions that we live in. So I would like to kind of ask as a last question, this, connecting it back to the design as we to the Biennale, as we have done with all designers today, what is for you the question of bifurcation in your work? How important is bifurcating there, or is it better not to bifurcate at all? Because we have all these conditions in front of us and we need to deal with them and need radical suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, like, ultimately, unlike a lot of science fiction, Planet City isn't built from some sort of imaginary technology. You know, that we haven't, like, in order to make the city work, we haven't cracked nuclear fusion. We haven't, like, received some sort of energy tesseract from an alien civilization that powers things. There isn't some magical material that's lighter than air that allows building to float. Ultimately, everything in Planet City is Planet City works and is constructed from technology that's already here. In many cases, it's actually like renewable energy systems that have been around for 15 or 20 years. What we're trying to do is talk about the idea that climate change is no longer a technological problem. It's actually a cultural problem. The systems, the technologies required to solve a lot of the problems we've created for ourselves exist, but it's our own political prejudices and cultural biases that have kept them at bay. So the bifurcation that needs to happen is a cultural one. It's a radical shift. The idea of Planet City is not, again, to make it in its literal form, but if we can get these systems working at the scale of 10 billion, there's nothing stopping us reimagining what we do today and rethinking a city like Los Angeles or London or anywhere we're based, and starting to re-gear and rewire those cities based around some of these systems to radically engineer a city to be powered by 100% renewables. All of these things are totally within our grasp if we choose them to be. So it's a very necessary paradigm shift that has to happen, and Planet City is the most extreme version of that. But hopefully it's a blueprint for much more modest means of reimagining that can happen. I guess that's that's my reading of a form of bifurcation, is a kind of a splitting that needs to happen from who we are today to who we necessarily need to be if we decide that we don't want to go extinct as a species.
I have to say that is exactly how the film works for us, as this kind of call for arms, but more call for arms for ourselves to kind of allow ourselves to imagine something and to understand also the radicality of ideas that is necessary to deal with the situation as we are in. And in this respect, we are absolutely grateful. And it was this wonderful moment where we actually asked you for a different film. And then you told us about this one. And we realized that this is the perfect ending that we have been looking for in the exhibition for a long time. So I thank you very much. I will hand over to Penny now. And Liam, please stay with us for the discussion.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Perhaps if Stephen could rejoin us, that would be great as well on screen. Then we can start the panel. Well, let me thank you both, first of all, for absolutely sort of taking our discussion much further forward than we've already been, but it pulls on themes, although you weren't present, it pulls on many of the themes that we've been talking about all day, which is great for those of you who have been with us all day. Okay, what we're going to do is start a question and answer session. And I'd just like to say to the audience, please, that now is the moment, if you've got questions either for Liam or Stephen, to put them into our Q&A facility on Zoom, and then we'll pick them up when you've done that and ask them. But obviously we'll start with ourselves. I've got a sort of, I suppose it is a question, but it's a comment as well. The most striking thing, listening to both of you speak one after the other, so sort of quickly, as it were, is difference of scale. It's so visible, and I think that's totally fascinating. I mean, it reminded me of Ernesto Rogers' comment about working from a spoon to a city, that that's where a designer works. They work across that enormous scale. On the one hand, Stephen very evocatively told us how he spliced rope and how the ends of a piece of rope sit on a stool. This absolute attention to detail, which is absolutely wonderful to hear, because you can engage with it when you describe it so carefully like that. And then on the other hand, we're looking at a reworked planet that is planetary scale, enormous. I think I'd just like to ask you both if you'd just like to think about that concept of scale, because obviously both are important. We need both. But how does it work for you? Stephen, maybe start with yourself.
Well, I mean, quite honestly, when I heard Liam mention that we wouldn't need objects, or we wouldn't fill our homes with objects, I got a little tense. I'm a collector, and the things around me are so important, from my library to every chair in the house, even though I recognize the privilege and luxury of that, that these things are not necessary for sustaining life, but they are necessary for me for sustaining joy and sustaining imagination. I guess I wonder what life would be to the individual that only sees themselves reflected in another, or reflected in a community and community action. It sounds really interesting, and makes me think about block parties and of course you mentioned the Carnival, Liam. But I look at the role that even in the carnival, right, the costume plays, and you know, the costumes being a kind of object, and I wonder how necessary, you know, that would be as well. So it's, I think, looking at our two practices and across those two different scales is a fascinating exercise. I'm definitely beginning and starting with, and I guess to date ending with more more than less, even though that may not be sustainable.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the costumes in Planet City become really critical, but I guess my response to the question of scale is that I hope that in the detail of such costumes and the detail of the objects we've created for Planet City, you can see as a kind of microcosm the larger scale constellations that are set in motion. So we work with a lot of local craftspeople to make these costumes, and we're trying to embody, like at the scale of the city, no new resources are consumed or extracted to produce the city, but rather we remine our existing world and just kind of recompose it in new constellations. So things like the costumes, that, you know, there's these extraordinary woolen pants worn by the high altitude bot herders of the city that are made by taking sweaters and unraveling them to their singular threads and then working with a local weaver to kind of weave them back together again as these extraordinary kind of woolen chaps. There's a lot of felting that the costumes are developed from, where again we took old clothes and old t-shirts and pulped them up and then repressed them as new felts, as a means to start to make new garments. Mm-hmm. So the material systems that operate at the scale of the planet are trying to be condensed into the material operations that might work at the scale of the body as well. So there's an ambition that even the smallest and most discrete of objects somehow contain within it the story of Planet City as a whole. And you know, these costumes do become really critical and important as objects. So you know, I don't think we wander the barren wastelands naked with nothing but ourselves. But I think I think when I talk about jettisoning a lot of the objects in our lives, I'm talking about the sort of disposable nature of so many things, the built-in obsolescence that sees us buy a phone, use it for 6 months, and then throw it away again when T-Mobile calls us up and says there's a new model coming out and your contract is up for renewal. So
I love the idea of one object being transformed into another by society. And I think we're beginning to see that for sure. I think that's super interesting. But I guess I challenge this notion of bifurcation just because, you know, as bell hooks used to say, that it doesn't necessarily have to be either or. That ultimately the either or forces us into this kind of competing paradigm, and in reality, right, it's probably both, and it's probably, you know, a very, very slow transition. Right now, I couldn't imagine changing any of my books into another book, but maybe there's a future maybe there's a future currency where, you know, I could take a book and it could be converted directly into another book, which would be fantastic. I guess I'm personally afraid of the notion that the digital will replace the physical in totality, and I think generationally speaking, looking at where young people are today, having gone through the pandemic and having to all of their activities to be mediated through technology all the time, and, you know, embracing friendships through technology alone, it doesn't feel like enough to me. It seems awfully unfulfilling. So there's something in our work about the legibility of humanity that's so important. to say that, you can look at a thing and understand how it's made, and it therefore activates your imagination and makes that thing desirable, right? And sort of forces us away from a digital or superficial relationship with things into a more intimate and personal relationship.
Thank you. That was both very, the idea of scale led to some very interesting ideas. I think you're both working from spoons to cities in various ways. I've got a question from a member of the audience. I'm just going to read it out to you.
Sure.
First and foremost, thank you to both speakers. I thoroughly enjoyed your talks. And this is actually for Stephen. Please could you elaborate on your comment regarding textiles' ability to translate various sensibilities, particularly how you manipulate or employ these fabrics to create a kind of soft architecture of inhabitation?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, I don't know if I've succeeded in creating a soft architecture yet. I've definitely tried. I think weaving is one of the textiles are common throughout all cultures in the world. And in fact, basketry and textiles are very much intertwined in that one sort of derives from another, right? As the kind of early structural expressions of what could be combined, what could be woven, let's say. The idea of a soft architecture for me, based in textiles, is really about, and I've used Annie Alber's essay, the pliable plane, as a way of building upon the relationship between textiles and architecture. But it's really a way for me to talk about the intelligence of softer materials. And when I mention the way that they can be coded with cultural information, I mean, I think that it has to do with centuries of vocabularies of I guess textile expressions that have been woven over time. So and when I think about where we can go today, do we have to have such permanent, let's say, partitions on the interior, for example? Could we also have an interior that's really truly about objects, and could those objects be more micro-architectural? Could the room be more furniture-like in its usefulness? And are textiles a way of getting us there? Is sort of the research that I kind of started with my students at Columbia. But I'm not sure where it goes from there. I'm hoping that obviously there's a lot of people working on similar themes.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to ask Jana or Kat if they have any questions. Kat.
Yes, I had a simple one, really building on both your discussions so far, and it was about the role of architects and designers, particularly in the kind of in Planet City. And it's obviously we've identified costumes as being one area for creativity, and Stephen's already expressed his concern around the kind of lack of space, it would seem, mentally as well as physically, for creating new objects. So I wondered, maybe Liam, you could talk a bit to that first, and then maybe Stephen, we started talking a bit about your kind of next steps, and I guess a bigger next step in terms of what we might see as a more general future of designers and architecture's role in the home.
Yeah, I mean, speaking as an architect, well, trained as an architect at least, but now an architect that doesn't make buildings, I think that there is hugely valuable work we can do which sits outside of the built spectrum. Most of the architects I know, actually, and I'm also a teacher, most of the architects that graduate from the studios and programs that I run don't actually go into the traditional forms of practice that we understand architects have having been doing across the last century. But the architect as politician or strategist, the architect of systems becomes as valuable, if not more valuable, in the current world that we've made for ourselves than the architect that fetishizes and creates buildings as singular objects. So I don't know, I think that the skill sets of designers and architects are extraordinarily meaningful and valuable, but to continue to define our practice as being someone that kind of continually makes physical things from nothing and puts them into the world, as opposed to taking something that already exists and reimagining the cycles and patterns of use of a building as a means to give it a new life, for example. I don't know, I think we undervalue those actions, or at least we define them as being somehow lesser than the traditional forms of practice. So the fact that Planet City attempts to make less isn't to say that designers and architects do less, but perhaps the nature of what we do slightly changes, and to be reimagining things, and that maybe an object that takes its form, like that form is only a very temporary stage in its life, and at a certain point it gets reimagined. I also imagine heirloom objects, things that become extraordinarily precious that we would want to keep and acquire. What does an heirloom phone look like? That isn't thrown away, but is passed down from my children to children. Like, this was your great grandmother's phone. She always wanted you to have it. What would that look like? What would that be made from? At the moment, our technologies are made from the most rarest and precious of metals, but we throw them away constantly. And then someone, in China or Africa reminds them and scavenges those materials. But what would happen if we treated them with the preciousness that they actually are evolved with? They're wrenched from the earth. They're geological objects. What if we treated them like an engagement ring? I don't know. So, like, relating to objects and their time cycles in new ways, I think, is an act of design. And that might not mean that we make as many new things, but I think it still means that we are active as designers in this new world that we're talking about.
I think Liam and I are probably both allergic to the traditional roles of of architecture. But I think we're seeing a shift in education today that should not be undervalued or underrated. And I think that the problems of the future will require many more people to embrace design and become their own problem solvers. The idea that nearly everything interesting my son learns today comes from somewhere else other than school, I think is quite powerful. And the idea of education being learning to educate oneself and having so many more people having the tools and access to all of the world's knowledge is quite powerful. And so if we think about that, and we think about the notion that Liam gave of a sweater being dismantled to make a new sweater, and the goals of, I think, a generation looking for design to have more meaning and to have a greater impact on the problems, the larger problems that we're facing, then we're going to see this idea of everyone being capable of design really going into action. And I think that's probably the only way we get through it, is that we have more and more people working together collaboratively across digital channels to solve the world's problems, and less sort of plutocratic authorship, I guess, I would say. So I'm very optimistic in that regard. I think that there's a lot of potential for the role of the designer to continue to move in a 21st century direction and further away from singular authorship and more toward collective authorship, which is, the community-based project is something that I think indigenous wisdom has known for centuries, right? So I think we're, in a lot of ways, we're using the tools of today to return to a way of working of the past to solve the problems of tomorrow, right?
Very nice. Jana.
Yeah, I would really like to connect to these last comments from Stephen, because what comes out, and we had this discussion earlier already, is this question of community, and how that there seems to be an urgency to really think about this collective making, collective being, but also, as Planet City shows us, it needs a very different idea of how do we live together and how do we connect with each other. As you have both nicely mentioned that you are teachers too, I feel what we probably would all agree on is that our system, the educational system, is very little kind of geared up to collective participatory work. It still focuses very much on the individual, in marking the individual, etc., etc. So I'm wondering, would one of the kind of really urgent questions that designers should address is kind of thinking around how do we design relationships?
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, how do we design relationships? You know, I guess I'm going back to something someone told me most recently, is that the majority of the vast majority of cultural production in the world comes from the quote unquote minority world, comes from the West. The other 90% of the world is you know, actively engaged in making a lot of things, but is not recognized as contributing to you know, what the West considers to be relevant and important. And so the design of relationships, I think, starts at the global scale, right? Starts at the recognition that, you know, one voice and one people shouldn't shout out all the other voices on earth. And how do we begin to make more space for those other voices to be heard? And I think, you know, the design of relationships on an intrapersonal level is so complex. It really requires, I think, looking out to then look inward, right? It seems like, and I'm referencing my son here because it's very personal for him. But the way that he's so comfortable communicating with vast amounts of people online that are in so many different parts of the world, without ever seeing them or meeting them or knowing them, I think is a clue, right? There's got to be something there. There's a kind of equity in these online forums that he's involved in that I mean, I really struggle to understand, just because I like to see people's faces and I like to meet people and understand them one-on-one somehow. But I think it's a really big question, and I think it's a very important one.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow from that, the design of relationships that I think we also need to be prioritizing is the design of kind of relationships between non-human species, you know, like, or our relationship to other entities other than each other, beyond each other as well. These are often relationships which are extraordinarily imbalanced, and as Stephen mentioned, both culturally and geographically imbalanced, but at the same time, there's a massive power imbalance between the way that we relate to entities of what we think of as being the natural world, how we relate to a tree or a parrot. You know, a lot of times these systems are again kind of organized in the service of ourselves. They're not really relationships as they are systems of servitude. So how do we start to imagine those type of relationships in new ways? I think is one of the projects of our generation, really, and starting to, yes, imagine leaving space for non-human entities is really important. And I think, you know, Planet City is one iteration of what that looks like. which is an extremely pragmatic version of making space for those other entities. But at the same time, I think there's much more intimate and personal things that we can be doing to try and open up the space for those new forms of interaction.
I don't know. I think it's going to take a revolution. It's really going to take a revolution. I think I mean, we're once again, we're speaking from such a privileged position when we talk about, you know, how we relate to trees before we talk about how we relate to people. There's so many people on Earth that have no voice. There's so many people on Earth that are barely surviving. And in terms of species, you know, it's I think, once again, it's a very privileged position to talk about other species before one talks about caring for one's own species. I don't know. I you know, this question of like, is design a game came up recently. I think through Disegno, there's a call for writers to consider what is the role of the designer today, and you know, are we just playing at sustaining existing hierarchical structures and systems that are built to, I guess, control and maintain the status quo, right? And it's difficult because I love what I do, and I love I love making things, and I love you know, this struggle to participate, I think is really important, and mankind will never stop making things. But at the same time, you know, we really have to ask ourselves, who are we designing for, and where are these things going, and you know, who and what systems are being supported by what we currently believe in. Yeah, I think it's going to take a revolution, a revolutionary way of, you know, shifting the balance of power. And it's a generational shift that has to happen.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that's a very good note in which we draw this session to an end. I think we've explored the implications of what you've both spoken about, you know, very fully, and it's been a great discussion. So thank you very much indeed, both of you. Thank you. Okay, well, we're going to move to the very last session, a very short one, really, just to finish off the day. Kat is going to moderate, but it's in essence, basically, the three of us are going to just offer some thoughts about what the day has offered. Kat, over to you.
Thank you, Penny. Yes, when I say moderate, it's really just the three of us giving a bit of shape to our reflections on the day. And I thought we could come to a close by talking about some common themes that the three of us found, through which we've already talked about in some of the conversations with individual designers and researchers. And it's been really striking, I think, actually, that there have been some commonalities. And I've taken some notes to that effect, but not with any hierarchy to them. That might be, I don't think I'm quite ready to digest everything, think about it in that sense. But I think in what's just in terms of our kind of kick off, and then with a couple, and then maybe Penny, Jana start adding to that. I think one of the first things that's become clear in terms of the relationship between design and the home and the position of the home is that we're in this state of transition. And that's in the two, you know, kind of big drivers around that have been COVID and are being climate change or the climate emergency, and that kind of different temporality is quite deliberate there. And we see how in that transition that the home, certainly Rianne talked about, the home isn't doing what it needs to do. In a sense, we're trying to find all these ad hoc solutions. You know, we talked about the shift from you know, different spaces that we need. And interestingly, Anne-Marie as well talked about the floor plan. Floor plans came up quite a lot today, I thought, in terms of how the kind of interior design of our home as a fixed set of walls and spaces that actually even Stephen Burke's talked about. Maybe that is kind of changing. And then how will it need to adapt from at every scale. We also had questions of scale, of course, come up very notably just now between Stephen and Liam, but I thought also it came up Rianne early on as well. And also interestingly, scales architecture has come up a lot today, but and maybe this is because the focus of today was design, but it felt like architecture somehow isn't equipped to do what it needs to be doing. And there was some talk about design being quicker than architecture in its response, about a kind of a bluntness or a slowness of architecture, which I thought was really interesting to reflect on where that's coming from. And the last point I'll make just for now, there are more, is how language came up as a point of discussion as well. We saw that with Anna Jane talking about this lexicon of critical activism, but also Anne-Marie talking about language, and it's something that we reflected on as well in the curating of the exhibition. So yeah, transition, scales and language is where I would start with our summarising.
So I'm laughing because I wrote down exactly the same 3 words.
Well, that's good.
I said we're in a state of transition. Will we go back or forwards? And then I said, well, language, that idea that new words are creating new behaviours, which will stick. So I think you're absolutely right, Kat. Those have come through very strongly. Perhaps just to extend that a little bit, we've talked a lot about what it means to be at home, whether that means being in a house or whether it means being in a community or whether it means being in a global planet. It could be in a lot of different places. But I think perhaps what I'm left with a little bit is what domesticity means now. And I think there's been nothing negative said about domesticity. I think all the comments that have been made about it are positive comments. And we've talked about it in a number of different ways. I think we now know what it isn't. It isn't any longer a sort of Victorian sofa, a comfortable Victorian sofa, which was the sort of somehow what was in our heads about what domesticity meant, cozy and comfy houses with comfy seats. It certainly isn't that. But nonetheless, it's something that's very important because it relates to our identities, which Stephen talked about a lot. It relates perhaps to the fact that there are some places, whether they be homes or whatever we want to call them, where we are at most ourselves. And I think that still remains a very important driver for the future. And so some kind of domesticity, whether it gets redefined, and I think perhaps it does need redefining, there needs to be a new notion of domesticity, but it remains important. And it was there before COVID, it was there during COVID, and it will be there after COVID, as indeed I think all these themes we've been talking about today have been. So perhaps we'll pass on to Jana as I think of some more things to say.
Yeah, I have similar words, but also some others. One term that I had written down was risk, that came up in some respects in relation to the question of transition. Also the question of turbulence came up now and then, that we live in times, in some respects we were disappointed how little, Anna and Rianne made this clear, how little actually COVID has shown us so much, and how little we then were brave enough to kind of really change the way we live, and that we kind of cozied back into old habits. Behaviors came up, which are interesting in terms of this relationship to us, to each other, and in relationship, as Liam now said, to other entities. I very much like that, despite we have chosen mainly kind of people who work in a contemporary space, that we talk a lot about history and the relationship and the importance of history, because that was something that was really important to us, of course, as historians, quite natural. However, we were always a little bit puzzled that in Saint-Etienne, quite often the exhibition is called the historic one, or the museum, museological one, which we don't necessarily see it as it addresses really the questions and values that speak to conditions we see around ourselves today. And very much address the future. I would like to probably close with one other kind of aspect that was mentioned a couple of times, the question of the emotional space, so that The home is an emotional space, and as such, not necessarily defined by these four walls, but could kind of be expanded or retracted, whether this is as small as a rucksack and a blanket, as Rian made it clear, or something that is much, much better as bigger than a dense city. And I will probably like, or I would like to close with a quote that I wrote down from Anna, that we have to learn to live with doubt. And I think that was really nice to kind of rethink many of these behaviors and conditions that we see around ourselves. And as Penny said, it is not about the sofa and the comfort of certain furniture that might function better than others. However, as Stephen rightly so said, and that was something that we really tried to kind of balance again and again in the exhibition, is that objects play a role and will play a role in any future home, whether this is a blanket or whether this is a stool. And that was nice that this was very much confirmed in the discussion today.
Interesting you talked about walls there, because I think another big theme that came up towards the beginning of the day was, whether it was for Olivier, talking about the idea of all these technologies in the home, and these kind of professional technologies or industrial technologies in the home, consumption technologies in the home, or in particular talking about the kind of a blurring of boundaries, really, kind of knocking down of walls. And see, Anne-Marie talked about the kind of hospital not needing walls in a sense, but we saw the idea that you can't talk about private space without talking about public space. And that was a really, I thought, a kind of a really strong thread that came up throughout every talk in different kinds of ways, actually.
Yeah, one more theme was food, and food seemed to come up again and again, but in different reasons, I think. For one, because that's where community happens, people sitting around a table and eating together is part of a communal activity. But perhaps more significantly today, the problems of food production, whether that be in the new planet or whether it just be in today's world with war going on. And I think that's one thing, as Jana says, if there's doubt and problems ahead, that's one of the big ones for sure.
And yet it shows the importance of certain values that we need to have in considering the home. The idea of care. Our homes might not, they might offer a different kind of comfort somebody talked about, and actually, the idea of kind of that is a place where you feel cared and you care for others, as something coming through. But I imagine we could keep on talking that in a way that that we will do, and we will need to, I think, after this, and hopefully we've provided everybody here with some food for thought as well. But I think it's a good point for us to close today's day. It's gone so quickly, actually. We've had some really fantastic talks. So I think that's all that's left for me to do, is to say some thank yous. And please, Jana, Penny, remind me, whoever it is that I forget inevitably. But first of all, I'd like to thank the Cité du Design for organising today's talk, in particular Maria Moreira, who's been behind the scenes making sure that everything happens. And also our interpreters, Corinne and Chloe, who've made the day possible and added to our international dimension. I'd like to thank Kingston, our university, and the Modern Interiors Research Centre, and in particular Fiona Fisher, who's been helping to field the questions to us today. That's been very helpful. I'd like to thank our two keynotes, Olivier Perico, who spoke at the beginning, and also Anne-Marie Adams. And I'd like to thank our designers and architects and artists who spoke with us today. So Rian McInk, Anna Jane, Plaid, Lauren and Brian, our two exhibition designers, Stephen Burks, and also Liam Young. And of course, I'd like to thank my two co-curators for we've been on this very enjoyable experience so far. I think that was everybody. So all that's left to say is thank you and goodbye.